You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
A few weeks ago, 200 Catholic bishops from Muslim countries were convened by Pope Benedict XVI at the Vatican to discuss the future of Christians in the Middle East, many of whom are now leaving the region. At the end of the two-week synod, while the Pope prayed for greater religious freedom and for peace in the Middle East, the bishops declared that Israel is primarily responsible for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, must end its occupation of the West Bank, and that Jews cannot use the Bible to justify their return to the land or their occupation of Palestinian territories. There was also a statement made that Jesus nullified and replaced the notion that the Jews are God's chosen people. Many in the Jewish world see the bishop's pronouncements as part of the growing campaign to delegitimize the State of Israel. How concerned should Jews be by the Catholic bishop's charges, and what is Israel's role in the Middle East conflict? To discuss these questions, we're joined by Elan Steinberg, Executive Director Emeritus of the World Jewish Congress, Neal Sher, the former Executive Director of AIPAC, and Professor Leonard Grob, Vice President of Meretz USA, all sharing opinion on this week's Roundtable. Well, gentlemen, I want to begin by talking about this flap at the Vatican. And Elan, when you heard about it, what was your initial response to the bishop saying that in some way the Jews cannot rely on the Bible for their legitimate claim to Israel, and that it is Israel who is at fault in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
There are two conflicting forces at play here. One is a political one, the other is theological. The particularly egregious statement was made by the Melkite bishop.
Yes.
And let's understand, for the sake of fairness, that the bishops themselves did not pronounce what we call this replacement theology, that the appearance of Jesus meant that the chosen people were no longer the Jewish people, but rather the Catholic Church. Again, for the sake of fairness, the Vatican, since Vatican II, has repudiated the notion of replacement theology and still recognizes the special place of the Jewish people and the place in the Bible.
But this is certainly not the sense you got from a bishop's statement.
Quite the opposite. What you have here, going back to this issue of a political construct, is you have bishops who represent a minority in a hostile region, a place dominated by Islam, some places radical Islam. These are practical people who simply, and I'm not going to use the offensive word, don't want to anger their more powerful neighbors. That's the political motive behind it. I mentioned the Melkite sect because what you have here is more of a representation of the Eastern Orthodox churches rather than the Catholic Church. And these are representatives who espouse a theology which is pre-Vatican II. So that's why you found this distinction. The bishop of the Melkite sect made these rather offensive comments, which we refer to as supersessionism or as replacement theology. And this is what the Vatican has, to some extent, gone out of its way to try to explain.
Bottom line, does it upset you, or do you think it is more noise than substance?
Yeah, I think noise. It certainly upsets me. It shouldn't be said. I don't think it needs to be blown out of proportion. I think, in fact, I can tell you quite quite frankly, I don't think the Vatican handled it very well, but they would just very much want for this to go away.
Mm-hmm. Neal, what was your reaction?
I think it is significant because I don't think it could be taken in isolation. It came, and the headlines, which really is what counts, comes at a time when Israel is under attack internationally from every quarter, every side. What people now call the delegitimization effort, which is in the United States, it's in Europe, it's everywhere. And to have the Vatican add to it, and I think this adds to it, to denigrate Israel, I think is very serious. Last year, the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, in a special session to the Knesset on security concerns, said that one of the major security concerns that Israel faces is what he called the Goldstone effect. Mm-hmm. And that is shorthand for the delegitimization. So viewed in that context, it's very, very disturbing. And it's not, it's not the first time this Pope, and we know his background, has said things that have certainly raised eyebrows in the Jewish community. Frankly, I don't think he cares about the Jewish community. Not too many Jews vote for the Pope. And, it can be irritations, surely, but, there have been a lot of efforts to improve Catholic-Jewish relations, and they're moving forward, they say, but then you have these incidents.
In all fairness to the Pope, he didn't make the statement.
No.
It was made by the bishops. Although Pope Benedict XVI is the one who put back into Catholic liturgy the notion that Catholics do have a reason to convert the Jews, and for a while that was taken out.
He's done that. He's done other things with changing the Mass, but the Pope is still the boss, and he could come down with a hammer if he so chose.
And he did not.
And he
choose.
didn't do it.
Yeah. Leonard, what was your sense?
Well, I was very disturbed by the supersessionist notions. I was yet more disturbed at the silence from the part of the Pope. Mm-hmm. That one bishop, Bishop Boustros, was, for political reasons, as Elan pointed out, made this statement was less disturbing to me than the fact that there was bystander behavior on the part of the Vatican. Mm-hmm. And although they did point out, I believe, that in the final overall statement of the conference, there was no mention of occupation as such, still in all, the Pope did not go out of his way to say that this was illegitimate, that this was not where we stand.
Do any of you feel this will impact long-term on Jewish-Catholic relations? Elan?
Well, I think it will impact Jewish-Catholic relations. What is extraordinary here, and I've been discussing it with some of my Jewish colleagues who are involved in interfaith activity, is you have basically two camps. Those who are skeptical of interfaith activity will use this as a weapon to say nothing has advanced. Those who, in effect, make a living from interfaith activity say we have to discuss things even more.
One of the things that sort of jumped out at me after the bishops made their statement was that it seemed to be saying, they did not say it literally, but they seemed to be saying that the Jewish claim to Palestine as their ancient homeland, their claim to Eretz Yisrael, which goes back for historical reasons, back to biblical times, that the Jews cannot rely on that argument for their right to establish a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael. And if that is so, that troubled me, that in some way that would become now the rhetoric used by even a section of the Catholic Church. Your reaction to that?
This troubles me greatly. Obviously, the people of Israel have an historic tie. They are inextricably bound up with ancient Israel. And this is a little different from saying God promised us this land and therefore we're going to build settlements.
That is correct.
But to deny the historical tie, this will only lead us, I think, down the absolutely wrong path. And I believe that insofar as the bishops began to utter these words, it will set a very bad precedent for the world at large.
Do either of you have the same reaction I did to this suggestion that somehow this undercuts a very important Jewish connection to Eretz Yisrael? And again, it's not about theology for most of us. It's not God said it belongs to us. But there is a historical connection that goes back to, what, 1900 BCE with King David and King Solomon establishing a Jewish commonwealth in Eretz Yisrael, and that is our ancient homeland for historical, let alone theological, historical reasons.
Oh, there's no question it's significant. Remember the flap that occurred when Obama spoke of Israel and suggested that it was because of the Holocaust that Israel came into existence, and that was its reason for being. And there was an explosion saying you're forgetting the historical connection between the land and the Jewish people.
And
so,
doesn't this seem to undercut that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's no controversy here.
Okay, we all agree.
We all
and that
agree
to me
about
is
that.
one of the most upsetting parts of it.
Yeah.
And that's why I say I don't put much stock in what a medieval espouser of theology has to say. I mean, that basically was his view, and and I think that was the problem there, which took it even further than the offensive statement the bishops had made.
Yes, although Neal's point is that in a time when, at the moment, the delegitimization of Israel seems to be rampant, I don't want any ammunition given to people who don't understand the subtlety of what you're saying.
But they've given it. They've provided
It's
that.
happened.
Sure.
Yeah. Leonard, they made a specific point of saying, the bishops, that it is Israeli occupation of the West Bank which is at the heart of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And they mentioned many things about the occupation itself, the security barrier, the blocks, the roadblocks, etc. What they were saying are some of the things I've heard people at Meretz say. Yes?
Well, in terms of occupation, yes. I believe that the occupation is a major, I would say, perhaps the major stumbling block at this moment to possible success in peace talks.
Does that mean that you believe Israel has been more responsible for the problem of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than the Palestinians?
Here's what I say. Again, I do not like to deal in quantitative terms and to say this one is more and this one is less. Both sides are responsible for the breakdown. I would say this, as the stronger party, it's very much in our Jewish tradition to say that those with strength should take the opportunity to initiate peacemaking, to concern ourselves with the poor one, the widow, the orphan. In this sense, I believe that Israel should be taking the initiative right now, and that there should be a continuation of the freeze. And I think it's only for rather narrow political purposes that Netanyahu is failing to do that.
The construction freeze on the West Bank.
That's correct. And so in this sense, I believe at this very moment, I believe that the burden lies on Israel to extend the freeze and so the parties can get back to the table.
I could not disagree more. And I can tell you, even from personal experience, I was the head of AIPAC during the so-called heady days of Oslo. And the argument that was repeated, the mantra was, Israel is the more sophisticated, the stronger, the adult in the relationship. Therefore, Israel has to make concessions. Therefore, Israel has to bend over. To the point where, and I say this, and I have lost sleep over it since, AIPAC was lobbying for Arafat, literally on Capitol Hill, lobbying to get him money. And there were all sorts of concessions that Israel made. And look where that led us. Israel has been making concessions left and right. Gaza, they pull out and Hamas takes over, and we see what the result was, the bombing of Sderot, Ashkelon. We see groups that are urging this administration, J Street in particular, to put pressure on Israel to make more concessions. My goodness, they've made concessions. The settlement, the freeze on construction. They did it for 10 months. It was considered a confidence-building step, measure, CBM. Israel did it with the expectation that Abbas would come to the table. He didn't go anywhere near the table. And now they want it for another couple of months.
Well, he did come the 9th month.
In the 9th month, yes. But the point is, Israel got nothing in return. And when are we going to learn? We're supposed to be a people of history. When are we going to learn? It's not going to happen. And one of the reasons it's not going to happen is that Abbas cannot deliver. He's impotent, completely impotent. He could make every promise in the world and it wouldn't last. Hamas would overtake him. So this notion that Israel, when we're talking about their security interest, has to sort of be more mature than the other side, we've seen how that works, and it doesn't. This is not a new notion. And it was a painful experience in the 90s with Oslo.
What Neal has said, you've heard this before.
I have, many times.
And your answer is?
First of all, I'm not sure that if an occupying power pulls out, that I would exactly call this a concession. I think that...
You're talking about Gaza now.
Yes, I'm responding to Gaza. And
What would you call it? If it's not a concession, what is it?
Well, I think that simply on moral terms and also on strategic political terms, both, I think that the occupation is a mistake. And again, I speak both morally and politically, strategically. And so I'm not sure that this is part of the so-called generosity of Israel.
Okay, let's just
to pull out.
Do you agree the occupation is a mistake?
You know, Mark, you put your finger on something before when you said it depends who's saying it. And I don't think we should get away from that. It's one thing for Meretz to say it. I can disagree with them. But I allow them, in terms of their intellectual honesty, to participate in the debate. Going back to what we said before, that's why I'm offended by what a Melkite bishop has to say. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not interested in his views.
Interesting. I understand.
So I think we have to begin by asking the question of who is saying this, what is their political agenda, and is there true objective peace? But I won't duck your question. The answer is occupation of territories is a problem. Is it the central problem? No. Is it a concession to leave Gaza? Yes, it is a concession to leave Gaza. Occupation in and of itself is not wrong. I want you to know that. The Geneva Convention...
Is occupation in and of itself wrong?
Absolutely.
I'll tell you one thing.
Well, then let me
it's
simply
not illegal.
tell...
It's not illegal
Forget
under
it being
international
illegal.
law, that's for sure.
Well, that's exactly right. That's why there are Geneva Conventions which provide for how an occupation can be undertaken. And in fact, the notion that Germany in post-war period should not have been occupied would have been very strange to me. Of course Germany should have been occupied. Of course Japan in the post-war period should be occupied. But I do accept the problem of occupation. I do accept the problem of settlements. What I don't accept is people's posturing on these issues. The fact of the matter is, if both sides really were seeking an agreement, there would be painful concessions from both sides. There is posturing now. So you have one side pointing to settlements, another side saying, well, you have to recognize us as a Jewish state. One side talks about loyalty oaths. Another side talks about occupation. The fact of the matter is that these are issues that should be addressed. When you begin to focus on these issues, I am more suspicious that they are a pretext to avoid a resolution of the problem.
But you're not suggesting that Leonard is using it as a pretext, are you?
No, I believe that Leonard and Meretz has an ideological position, some points of which I agree with, some points I disagree with, and that's why I say I certainly welcome him into the debate as opposed to others who have a different agenda.
By the way, in some way, I'm only uncomfortable for you because at the moment, two people seem to disagree with you,
Yes.
and you're only one person. It doesn't mean 2 to 1 makes them right and you wrong, and you're totally able to handle yourself.
I'll help you out. Neal is wrong on a lot of things, too. Okay, so I'm the only one who's always right.
I find this issue to be a pivotal issue for Jews to deal with. Has the occupation been intrinsically immoral and wrong? You seem to be saying, Leonard, that intrinsically the occupation has been wrong. Do I get it right?
You got it right.
Okay, and the only question I would ask you, and then I want to hear what all three of you have to say, really. What was Israel's alternative?
Israel's alternative in 1967 was to follow the advice of Ben-Gurion and many others who said this is the time for us to do peacemaking.
And didn't they try? I mean, and wasn't Khartoum the answer to Israeli attempts to give back the West Bank? And hopefully everybody now knows, Khartoum is where the Arab League said, no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. That was the answer to Levi Eshkol saying, we will basically give back all of the West Bank. So when I hear that, I say to myself, what are you referring to that I don't know about?
And who did Eshkol want to give the West Bank back to? To Jordan.
Jordan.
Yes.
We're talking about a context which is completely different from what we're speaking about today. Even in those days, those who wanted to return the territories, no one even spoke of a Palestinian state. There was no Palestinian people. So I think we're mixing apples with oranges.
Well, and even, you don't have to go back as far as 67. Just look at what happened when Barack, in conjunction with President Clinton, offered to Arafat virtually everything that they had been demanding, virtually everything. And it was a gutsy move on the part of Barack. He took a lot of heat, but Israel was prepared to do it. And what was Arafat's response? The Intifada.
The Second Intifada.
Second Intifada. So, I mean, and that is, you know, Israel, you have to consider those to be concessions. And he was prepared, Barack was, to take a severe political hit. And look what he was dealing with. And Abbas is not much different.
See, I assume that when I speak to someone of your stature, there's an intelligent reason that you think this. It's not, I don't assume it's because somehow you are emotionally committed to this, but that you believe both emotionally and intellectually that Israel made a serious mistake by either engaging in the occupation to begin with, and certainly by sustaining the occupation. What I hear from the other side is, what was Israel's choice if the other side never was willing to make peace with Israel? And I really want to hear what someone from your position answers those who argue Israel had no alternative. It was not that Israel set out to conquer territory or to add to a greater Israel. And I do admit there were those who, for a period of time in the late 70s, were looking for a greater Israel out of a situation that suddenly presented itself. But initially, and throughout the entire process in general, it's not been that Israel wants to. I've never heard an Israeli say to me, we love occupation and want to occupy. All I hear them say is, it's horrible for my children, it's horrible for my grandchildren, the settlers are creating a problem that I don't want to deal with, and if we could make peace with the Palestinians, we give back the whole West Bank, as Barack said in 2000, 2001. You must see something we don't see. What is it that Israel could have done that you understand that the general Jewish community misses?
Let me say this. There were negotiations on many levels going on in 1967 and throughout the decades since. I think we can't say that because of the three no's at Khartoum that Israel had no partner, because the Arabs then, Palestinians now, they are saying we have no partner on the Israeli side. Each side is saying we have no partner. If we talk with Palestinians, this is what you hear. I'm saying that Israel could have taken steps at that point, and throughout these years, these 43 years since 1967, to move closer to the Palestinians. When we talk about Camp David and all that we gave them, first of all, we don't know exactly what happened at Camp David. There are varying accounts.
The Palestinians have a very different narrative, by the way.
Absolutely, even among Jewish, right? I mean, Rob Malley, who was at Camp David has a very different interpretation from others who have written about Camp David. So we don't know exactly what went on there.
But you're suggesting that Israel could have done what? When you said, come closer to the Palestinians, what are you talking about? Because it sounds to me like you're suggesting Israel should have just picked up and left the West Bank.
Well, I can see, if we're talking about a few military bases, which is how the occupation started, a few sites that were designed to protect Israel's Eastern Front. If you're talking about that, that's one thing. If you're talking about 300,000 settlers and another 250,000 in East Jerusalem, you're talking about a whole other phenomenon. So this is not natural growth. This has to do, to a large degree, with conquest and not with Israel's security. Israel's security lies in the removal of settlements, or certainly working out right now an arrangement whereby the large settlement blocks are kept and a comparable in size piece of land, and hopefully in quality as well, piece of land is given to the Palestinians. I'm not saying that right now 550,000 settlers will be removed, but there will be somewhere between 80 and 100,000 settlers who will have to be removed. So when you ask what could Israel have done, I'm not talking about the few settlements that began as military outposts for security reason. I'm talking about what, to a large measure, is, unfortunately, as a Jew, I'm ashamed to say, a land grab. And it's either been a land grab or it's been a fixed ideological position on the part of many religious Jews saying this is the land that was promised to us and this is where we are going to stay. The combination of the two characterize settlement, not Israel's security.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, let's begin with unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank.
Leonard said something much more subtle. What he said was Israel had no business settling the West Bank.
Well, you know, if my aunt had wheels, she'd be a bus.
That's not fair. That's not
fair.
No,
it isn't.
No,
you want to deal with the reality.
Did Israel make a mistake? Was Israel wrong?
No. I must say, at the time, it did not make a mistake.
Explain
I don't
why.
think so.
Explain
I don't think
why.
so, because in fact, you were dealing in a context in which there was no willingness for the surrounding Arab states, much less the Palestinian people who had not yet coalesced, to even recognize the existence of the State of Israel. When I say it was a different context, remember, at that point, 20, 30 years ago, no Arab leader would even say that the State of Israel should exist. The Six-Day War was not about the occupation. The Six-Day War was about the very existence of the State of Israel. If you ask me today, are Arab leaders willing to accept the existence of the State of Israel? I think yes, not all, but certainly I think we have a critical mass willing to do so. So the negotiating process is different today. Having said that, we have to focus on what the reality is today. No, a unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank won't work. It didn't work in Gaza, as we saw. On the other hand, there really are two fundamental questions that have to be addressed. Everything else, as they would say in the Talmud, is just commentary.
Those are?
Is Netanyahu serious that for the sake of peace, he would essentially be willing to withdraw from most of the West Bank with minor alterations here and there? Mm-hmm. We know if there is a peace, what it would look like.
Yes.
We know what it would look like. That's the first question. The second question, is Abbas serious and able to deliver in terms of bringing about the recognition of Israel in peace, in defensible borders, as a Jewish state? He says he is, by the way. I'm really not interested.
Yeah, but you have a sense. What's your sense about Netanyahu? What's your sense about Abbas? And then I want to hear
I'm going
Neal.
to surprise you. I'm optimistic.
Both of them mean it now.
Yeah, I think both of them are, the two blind men in the dark who are struggling to try to figure this one out.
You did a caveat Abbas may want it. You also said he has to have the power to deliver.
Does Netanyahu have the power to deliver?
Yes, Netanyahu does.
Okay.
Does Abbas?
I'm glad that Bibi has spoken to you about it.
I'm glad you've come here so I can clarify
Yeah,
that for you. Does Abbas have the power to deliver?
Let's put it this way. If he doesn't, nobody does.
Okay, how do you answer those two questions?
Bibi, you know, I take him at his word. I mean, that he's making good faith efforts. But I think the other issue, in light of the history, in terms of what Abbas is prepared to do, what he can do, is much more serious. You know, the Palestinian Authority, through their TV, their radio, and their other media, and there are people who monitor it, they consider all of Israel, Haifa, Jaffa, Tel Aviv, to be occupied territory. There are strong segments there. They're not concerned about the Palestinian refugees. There is still deep-seated within that movement the objective to destroy Israel, and they take great comfort in what Ahmadinejad says and others. I think somehow this notion, which we've heard for a long time, that the problems of the Jewish state were caused by the Jews, I can't accept that. The Palestinian issue is in many ways a phony issue. If all of the people who supposedly support the Palestinians, the Saudis, the Jordanians, and the others, would have really cared about them, they could have done something ages ago. They haven't. This notion of building some apartments as being the main obstacle for peace, it's ridiculous.
So you're to the right in this instance of Elan.
Yeah.
You do not believe Abbas even means it?
No.
Okay. And you, Leonard?
First of all, we need to recall that in 2002 and several times ratified again, the Arab League has come forth saying 2 states on the 67 borders. It's true that on the refugee issues there is some ambivalence and a reference to UN Resolution 194 concerning the refugees is problematic, but still in all, this is a comprehensive agreement on the part of Arab states saying we agree with peace. Israel has not bothered even to issue any kind of formal response in 8 years to this declaration. So the notion that somehow the Arabs want the caliphate to extend from the Mediterranean all the way to the Jordan and beyond, I think is mistaken. There are extremists. They are beginning to be marginalized, and they will continue to be marginalized once there is a Palestinian state, once people go about their business, earning a living, having clean water, having good jobs, having good schools, and so on. The extremists will be further. Will there still be some terrorism on the part of the extremists? Yes. It's not going to disappear all at once, but slowly it will be marginalized. I do not believe that the body of Palestinians or the body of Arab states is in their heart of hearts, perhaps, they would wish, just as in the heart of hearts many Israeli Jews wish that all of Israel, greater Israel, would be theirs. But they know that in their heart of hearts they can't get that. And they will recognize the fact that 2 states is the only solution and that we have models for it. Geneva is a model for it. The Clinton parameters is a model for it. I don't believe that Arabs are out at this juncture to say all of Israel is illegitimate.
Neal?
Well, the truth is that many of them do say it. It's been on Palestinian TV, controlled by Abbas. But somehow the notion that Israel has to, the Arabs or the Palestinians won't come back to the bargaining table because of some of the construction of some of these apartments is absurd.
Is it absurd?
No, it's not absurd to me at all.
If you're a Palestinian,
if you talk with the people in Silwan, if you talk with the people in Sheikh Jarrah who are being dispossessed, kicked out of their homes, I think you feel very differently. It's symbolic, by the way. It's not just that there are a few homes that we're arguing about here or there. there is a symbolism that is crucial here.
Why didn't they come to the table during the 10-month moratorium?
Because building was going on in East Jerusalem.
Nonsense.
And because despite the so-called freeze, there were so many exceptions to the freeze. When I was in Israel last and went into East Jerusalem and the West Bank, you see construction going on because public buildings, communal buildings were exempt. Buildings that had already had begun were continuing. The notion that there was some kind of halt to settlement building during those 8 months before the Palestinians came to the table is absurd.
Any comment?
Yeah, and you'll forgive me that I think you are being quite naive in a number of things that you are saying here. Quite frankly, I am less impressed by what an agglomeration of non-democratic states of the Arab League, countries that violate the human rights of their own citizens, are going to have a less than jaundiced view of how the Palestinian-Israel conflict is going to be settled. So I'm really not that interested in the views of the Arab League. That it is a cynical institution, and I think we're really avoiding the real question here as to how this process is going to advance or not advance.
Incidentally, my own sense is that there is so much to be gained by peace from both sides that there really should be nothing that keeps people from the peace table, from the conversation. Whether Israel is building or not, many people have said until Obama opened his mouth, there was building and these Palestinians were willing to talk even despite the building. But that even if they're building apartments, and even if there are Arabs who are Palestinians who are losing their home, go and talk if you think there's any chance for peace.
Look, Israel is
because
prepared.
there's so much to be gained. And Israel should go and talk whether they say it's a Jewish state or not. Everybody should be talking to everybody. There's nothing to lose, only to gain. And to me, it's, again, the word posturing was used earlier. It seems to me it's so much posturing. I just say to myself, if a boss really wants peace, what does he care right now if they're building? Let's just sit down, work it out, and then we'll carve out the borders and we'll worry about where we go from there. And my only other comment is this. Do you feel, Leonard, that it is in any way appropriate for the Palestinians to say that the Jews who live in settlements now must leave the West Bank, as opposed to they're welcome to stay under Palestinian sovereignty? It must be Palestinian sovereignty. But if they're willing to live under Palestinian sovereignty, Jews have as much right to live on the West Bank as Arabs and Palestinians have the right to live in Israel.
That would be my hope, that the Palestinians would agree to that.
Do you hear that coming from the Palestinians? Is that Abbas's position now? I thought it was the exact opposite.
It is not his position at the moment, but these are early position takings, and they will retreat. There will be a retreat from it, just as...
Okay, I interrupted you. What you wanted to say?
Frankly, I think those are issues which are secondary to the central question of whether the two sides finally want to come to a
Because if
resolution.
they want to, they can get it done.
That's the
Okay.
point.
Yes.
That's the point.
I have a couple of quick questions I want your response to. We are running right now a debate between Alan Dershowitz and Jeremy Ben-Ami. Ben-Ami, of course, is the president of J Street. And a couple of things were said. I want your comments on them. Alan Dershowitz said when it comes to Israel's human rights record, he would give Israel no better than a C+, or with grade inflation, a B-. I guess he means on a curve. To what extent do you feel that, in fact, Israel's human... Oh, and then he says, and no other nation gets a better grade.
No other nation anywhere.
Anywhere. And he also says no other nation in history, faced with what Israel has been faced with, has done better. But that Israel's human rights record is basically a C+, B-. And I wonder my sense is American Jews would be surprised to hear a Dershowitz give Israel that low a grade, although he says again, comparatively speaking, it's as good as anybody ever gets. But what is your sense of when you hear a Dershowitz say, Israel gets no better than a C+, B-? Is he right?
Depends what scale he's using. Let's put it this way. Israel's human rights record is comparable to those which we admire here in the West. It is of a different standard, unfortunately, that we experience in the West Bank, that we experience in the Third World as a whole. You can't compare the two. The one thing the Palestinians and the Arabs have often said, which has an element of truth, Israel is a Western country in the Middle East. I don't take that as an insult, but I think that's the standard against which it's measured. You want to compare Israel's human rights record with the record of certain West European states, which, if you really examine very closely, would shock most Americans. They don't have the kinds of civil rights and human rights protections that we take for granted here, insofar as free speech is concerned, insofar as freedom of assembly is concerned. So Israel is on a par with Western Europe, which, as I said, is completely different from the standards we experience in the Third World.
Are you saying that everybody gets a C+, including Israel?
If you want to use those standards. If you want to...
C+ sounds terrible to me.
Well, let's put it this way. Israel gets an A as compared to Libya.
Yeah. But who cares about Libya?
Well, that's the point. And I think, and I have to say something. There is a condescending attitude there which we should not accept. I simply believe that Libya, a Palestinian state, Egypt, Iran, should be measured against the same standard that Israel is measured against. And clearly, we have made an intellectual decision.
Okay, they get an F. But
there's another important point. I mean, how Dershowitz came up with these grades, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the point that he made was that nobody does better, I think is significant. But another point that I would make is, as opposed to any of the other countries surrounding Israel and in the Middle East, Israel, with its courts, the Supreme Court in particular, with its internal investigations, when it has been brought out that there are violations, they investigate thoroughly, they prosecute, they have watchdog apparatus. Is it perfect? No, no country is perfect, including our own. But the fact is, can you think of any other state in that area, in that neighborhood, which investigates its own human rights abuses?
Does it upset you that Israel only is a C+?
Well, I wish. And
by the way,
I wish the professor gave a B. He gave an A+ rather.
He doesn't give America.
I understand, and I think that's the comparison is the point. Yeah.
What do you say?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't, just one side point here, I wouldn't paint as broad a brush about the Third World as you did, Elan. But aside from that, I think it's a fair characterization. I think, by the way, the High Court is in deep trouble in Israel. The fact that it has a High Court and the fact that cases are brought before it is one thing. The fact whether those decisions are implemented is another, and Israel's recent behavior in this regard is much less than a C+. But I think it's fair to say, certainly, that Israel is no worse, and probably under the circumstances as good. But as a Jew, I don't want C+. One violation, it seems to me, is too many. And although I'm not living there and under the conditions that Israelis are living there, I would say that my aspirations are, as a Jew, that we should strive for A and not be satisfied with C+.
Okay, I agree 100% with you. I'll tell you what the problem I hear is. The problem is that there are people, especially young people right now on college campuses, who use what you're saying to basically turn against Israel. You say it from a posture of commitment to and love for Israel. You say, I understand what the C+ is, I understand it's basically what other nations have, and I want Israel to do better. But other people hear that Israel only gets a C+, and for them it's a reason to be critical of and turn away from Israel.
I think I would, as an educator, I think I would be very careful about how I spoke about Israel to different parties. For example, with some of my Palestinian friends, I don't use the word Zionism. I wouldn't say I am a Zionist, and I say it here proudly. I'm a Zionist with a difference, but I'm a Zionist. I wouldn't say that in certain company.
I'm very disturbed to hear that.
Yeah.
I must tell you quite honestly, I'm very disturbed to hear that.
Because I believe that it will cut off dialogue before we have a chance to understand each other, and then I can say, well, it may be their problem, but
what
as
if
an
they
educator,
were to say it's a problem if you identify yourself as a Jew?
well, of course I would take exception to that.
Well,
of course I would take
they
exception
would have
to
no
that.
problem
But
saying they're anti-Zionist.
Yes.
No problem at all.
I just don't want to shut off dialogue at the outset.
No.
You're confusing means with ends. Dialogue is not an end in itself. Dialogue is a means to an end. And just because a dialogue is shut off because of unreasonable views of the other side does not mean you don't pursue the objectives. So I would urge you, please, to not confuse means with ends. Dialogue is not an end in itself. It is a means toward an end.
Well, I would argue that as an educator, one has to proceed stepwise, and that one has to be sensitive to whom one is talking about, not in a condescending or patronizing way, but simply on the basis of being a good pedagogue. I don't say in a classroom, I don't say to students everything right away that will come about at the end of the lesson. And my hope is that at the end of the lesson, I will proudly be able to say I'm a Zionist.
Since we're talking about, by the way, this idea of do you say you're a Zionist or not, Leonard, what was your sense when you heard the bill was introduced that would ask people who wanted to become Israeli citizens, and that would apply to Jews and non-Jews, they would have to pledge allegiance to the Jewish democratic state of Israel?
Of course, originally it did not apply to Jews.
It did not, but they
and
changed that
non-Jews.
almost immediately.
Yes, it's true that Netanyahu came. Yeah,
Anything wrong with that?
yes.
What's wrong with
There
that?
is. I believe that there is nothing wrong with asking a citizen to pledge allegiance to the state and be willing to actually put their body on the line. We do that in our own oaths here when one takes citizenship in the United States. But to inject the word Jewish at this point in time, and with Jewish having so many different meanings having to do with peoplehood, meanings having to do with religion, it seems to me that it is premature and probably will never be mature enough definition to have people swear an oath of allegiance to a Jewish state.
I don't think there's anything inherently wrong in non-Jews pledging allegiance to the Jewish state of Israel, because I don't know if you know what the Pledge of Allegiance to Argentina is. It's to the Catholic state of Argentina.
Well, I would be opposed to that if I were an Argentinian.
Well, maybe you would be, and maybe I would be, but I don't hear the Jewish community in Argentina complaining about it, or even the Muslim community in Argentina. I don't think that is the real issue. If you're asking whether this issue was raised as an obstacle to the peace process, yes, I think it was. I think this came almost as a bolt out of the blue, and I think the reasons it was raised were cynical ones. And even though, as I said, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, there's another good Jewish expression which says, don't be right, be smart.
What do you say?
Look, every state, every nation has the right to define itself as it sees fit. And the notion of an allegiance, a pledge of allegiance, a declaration, that's standard fare. I don't have any problem with it whatsoever, whether they call it a Jewish state or just the state of Israel. To me, it's a non-starter of an issue. I think Elan's correct. It was probably put in play for domestic political reasons. It's certain for anybody to say this is what's keeping the parties, the serious parties, from getting to the table. It's ridiculous.
But I seem to be on the farthest end here, because for me, Israel was created as a Jewish state, and anybody is willing to live here in Israel, as long as they live in a Jewish state.
But what does that mean?
It means it was a state created with the intent. The intent of the creation of Israel was created for the Jewish people to work out their destiny.
Well, that's why I think...
And that's what the United Nations said when it made the partition plan.
No
it created Israel as a Jewish state.
You're not requiring the people to become Jews,
not at all.
of course.
It's what David Ben-Gurion said when he read the Declaration of Independence. As a Jew, this was a Jewish state. Everybody knows it's a Jewish state. And I find Mr. Abbas or anybody else in the Arab world who doesn't want to call it a Jewish state to be not only offensive to the Jewish people, but also making a political statement of their own. And if, in fact, this was done for political reasons, it was in reaction to the fact that suddenly there were American Jews, but American Jews, American Jewish leaders saying that Netanyahu had no business using the word Jewish in relationship to the state of Israel as if it weren't Jewish. Right. And right now we're running a discussion I had with Kenneth Bob, who was with Amenu. And I said to him the same thing. He also was upset with it initially. His ultimate answer was, it's the timing that bothers him, not the concept, which is not how he began. But I asked him, would he want to change Hatikva? Would you want to change Hatikva?
I would, if this were a matter of truly making Israel a more a democratic state, where 1.2 million Israelis with Palestinians with Israeli citizenship,
yes,
could come to live in greater harmony,
yes,
with their Jewish citizens, I would reconsider. I don't think an anthem is solemn. I think that it can border on idolatry.
You don't want Israel to be a Jewish state.
No, I do want Israel to be a Jewish state.
If you want to be a Jewish state, why can't the anthem talk about the soul of the Jew?
Yes, I think it can talk about the soul of a Jew, and I personally would like to see this happen, because when I hear Hatikva, all kinds of things run through me that are very, very important and speak to my depths. I'm saying that peace is more important to me than that feeling that goes deep inside me when I hear Hatikva.
You're making an incredible compromise. You're compromising with the essence of why the Jewish state was created. The Jewish state was created for Jews. And then it's open to anybody who wants to be a citizen. And you're granted full citizenship rights. But you have to understand, there are certain countries where you go to that country, if they give you citizenship, fine. But if you go to certain countries, you will always be a minority. And the question is, how does a society deal with its minorities? In Israel, there hopefully will always be a non-Jewish minority. Hopefully, because if the minority becomes the majority, democratically Israel will have problems. But I want Israel to be, I want every American Jew, every young Jew and every Jew my age, I'm no longer young, I want us to be proud that there is a state created for the Jewish people, which we then open to anybody who wants to live with us, and you don't have to live with us.
I agree fully. That here's my problem. I think it is a matter of timing. By the way, I agree with Kenneth Bob on this issue. I think
but I believe there's a reason for the timing. Timing doesn't bother me. I believe I believe it is necessary at this point in time, at the latter part of 2010. It is critical, in my view, for the Jewish people worldwide to go on record that there's no ambivalence here. There's no ambiguity here. Israel is a Jewish state, and that's what you're making peace with.
But who is thinking otherwise? Do you think that the Palestinians are believing that this is not going to be a state with a Jewish majority?
Yes,
I believe there are
Palestinians who still want a right of return for Palestinians, who do not ultimately see the intrinsic Jewish nature of Israel. I believe that when Fayyad walks out on Ayalon at a UN press conference because Ayalon wants him to say 2 states for 2 people, it's because there are some in the Arab world who do feel there should be 2 states, but they should be 2 generic democratic states.
When the Palestinians are polled on the West Bank, when they are polled as to whether or not they wish for a 2-state solution, overwhelming numbers, 65, 70%, say they do. How can they, at the same time, not acknowledge that there is a Jewish state?
Then why not? Then why is there harm in saying it?
Because there is a problem. There is a problem with their understanding of the 1.2 million Palestinians living with Israeli citizenship, because in fact they do not at this moment enjoy equal rights, and there is a sense that they do
on the books.
They do on the books.
On the books, they have absolutely.
If the loyalty oath were to say, I swear allegiance to a Jewish state and the state of all its citizens, or if it were to say even what Barak offered, which is to remind people what the Declaration of Independence says, which is as close as Israel has to a constitution, then I would feel certainly much better about it. But without that reminder that Israel is both Jewish and democratic, they have to go hand in hand. They're twins.
But in the allegiance, it's pledging allegiance to a Jewish and democratic state of Israel.
That I would accept.
Well, that's what it says.
You know, Mark, there's something.
That's what it says.
There's something very
Just a minute.
fundamental.
That is what it says. You're pledging allegiance to, the quote is, Jewish and democratic state of Israel. That does not bother you, does it?
That certainly bothers me.
By the way, this is a press release in the making, you understand.
This bothers me. It certainly bothers me less because of the ambiguity in the word Jewish.
Okay, well,
I don't think it's the damn business of anybody in the diaspora to tell Israel what their allegiance, their Pledge of Allegiance should say. That is something that every nation on earth decides for itself, and it's none of our bloody business.
very quick question. In the Ben Ami-Dershowitz debate, Ben Ami says both narratives, which is now the new word, as if it's a story. Both narratives, it offends me, that word. Not both histories. Both narratives are true. The Jewish narrative and the Palestinian narratives both are true. Is that true?
There isn't a Jewish narrative. There isn't a Palestinian narrative.
But you know what he means.
Well, what he means is what my grandmother used to talk about. There's right and wrong on both sides. I must say most of the right is on the Jewish side, and I want that to be very clear. I hate this kind of symmetry here. There shouldn't be symmetry. I don't believe that the Jewish state of Israel has always been right, is perfect, but the notion that there should be the equivalence between what has happened to it and because of it is something which I find offensive.
Are both narratives true?
I would not use the word true or false. The narratives are what they are. There are different stories that people tell each other. There are, by the way, I agree, there's no one narrative. However, there is a dominant line of, there's a dominant storyline that one can point to.
Absolutely.
And I wouldn't use the words true and false. I would take this as a given and then work to forge internarrative, to try to find those places where the narratives can meet. And then you work at the points where you have the best shot at a beginning, and then you work outward to the harder points. That's what a peace process is about. It's about narrative, and you have to acknowledge that in fact there are two storylines here. Sami Adwan and Dan Bar-On in their textbook, an Israeli and a Palestinian, have created a textbook in which there is the Palestinian narrative, let's say with regard to Oslo or to earlier events. On one side of the page, the Israeli narrative on the other side, and in the middle is blank. And the students are attempting to forge what I would call internarrative. And by the way, the education ministry is having a very hard time allowing students even to read the Palestinian narrative.
I understand. Leonard, I want you to explain this to me. Here's the danger people see. If you argue that both narratives are correct or are in some way reflect the view of their own people.
Yes.
And the narrative of the Palestinian is the Jewish people had no right to the land. They took my land. And the fact that they want to claim that they have a historical claim is somewhat spurious from their view. As far as they know, their great-great-grandfather owned that olive tree, and that gives them more of a claim than the fact that Jerusalem was once under the sovereignty of King David, that the Jews threw us out, and that it was a Nakba. It was a catastrophe. The moment you say to somebody, you have your narrative and you have your narrative, at that point, it seems to me that for many people, you have taken the grounding and the foundation for Israel and what Israel was out of existence.
But you're assuming that that's the end point when you say you have your narrative and I have mine. I would say that's just the beginning point. And you work from there to make sure that there is the beginning of understanding that that's not how it was, that the Palestinians were not the original people on the land and so on. You work it out through a dialogical and educative process. That's what education is about.
Interesting. Any comment?
I believe the truth is indivisible, and just because one side presents a position and another side presents another position, you don't split it down the middle. You might accept a compromise for the sake of moving ahead, but I'm sorry, history cannot be distorted for the sake of political ends.
Of course, I'm not talking about splitting down the middle.
Well, the white down the middle sounded like you meant that.
No, I meant that the sides need to come into contact with each other. They need to talk to each other. And they need to do this at the grassroots level.
Is a historical truth. Do you think Elan is right? There's a historical truth.
There are truths which are more historically correct than others. Yes.
You know, they always say the winners
Yes.
write
You
the
should
history.
run for office, that is.
They always say the winners write the history.
Yes,
They do, of course they do.
but the winners aren't always on top.
Okay.
Elan is euphoric today because his daughter received an 800 score on the SATs.
Mazel
There you
tov.
go.
Mazel
There you
tov.
go.
What's her name?
Her name is Lena, and she now has bragging rights for the entire family.
Well, congratulations, Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Anybody with a daughter who gets an 800 on any SAT deserves to be very, very proud.
Indeed.
And I am so proud to be able to be with the three of you and to present you to our audience. Leonard, Neal, Elan, I love the three of you so much, and I love talking to you. I think you bring not only passion, but you bring unusual intellect to bear no matter what subjects I throw at you. And I thank you so much for, people have to understand, you go out of your way to get to sit at this table. I appreciate the fact that you make the effort and you go out of your way. I will continue to chase you, invite you, try to get you in the chairs as often as I can. Thank the three of you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for inviting us.
And those are the thoughts of Elan Steinberg, Executive Director Emeritus of the World Jewish Congress, Neal Sher, the former Director of AIPAC, and Dr. Leonard Grob, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at New Jersey's Fairleigh Dickinson University, and Vice President of Meretz USA. I hope you enjoyed hearing them as much as I did. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you have to the things heard on this edition of Roundtable. And if you want to be in touch either with Leonard or with Neal or with Elan, please, you can do so. Send your emails to me and I will forward them on to them. I look forward to hearing from many of you this week. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.